Hello and welcome to Yeas and Nays, hosted jointly by FMC, the Association of Former Members of Congress, and Braver Angels with Malice Towards None. We are delighted that you have joined us virtually, like almost everything else in life these days, for this bipartisan discussion, and hope you'll continue to join FMC and Braver Angels every Friday morning until the election on November 3rd. Each Friday, you will hear two former members of Congress from opposite sides of the political aisle dive into some of the most prominent issues discussed by the presidential and congressional candidates as we approach Election Day. Not only will this be a weekly issue-specific conversation between a Republican and a Democrat, but we also will focus on the role of citizens and civic organizations, how to reduce the divisiveness that is plaguing our country, and how citizens can become engaged in our political process without succumbing to pointless hyperpartisanship. And today, for our very first program, we're taking a big picture look at the campaigns to get this project started. So our topic is how the two parties are framing their campaigns, what issues are emerging, and what issues we expect to hear more about over the next 2 months, and what the citizens should take away from the campaigns thus far. I'm Pete Weichlein, I'm the CEO of FMC, and I'm really thrilled to start this new program and have a conversation with former Representative Payne, a Democrat from Virginia, and former Representative Dennis Ross, a Republican from Florida. Dennis and LF, thank you both so much for lending us your time and your expertise. So looking at the two campaigns thus far, there certainly doesn't seem to be even an inch of common ground. But this election, like every other election in the history of democracy, is basically about two things: how to keep your family safe and how to provide for your loved ones. So in essence, both parties offer the same end product, safety and prosperity, but different paths toward those goals. LF, if I may start with you and the Democrats, both Vice President Biden as well as House and Senate races, not to mention state elections, what vision for a better future are you hearing from the Democratic Party right now?
Well, Pete, first, thanks to you and to FMC and to Braver Angels for sponsoring this. And Dennis, it's nice to see you and look forward to this conversation. To your question, the Biden campaign and the Democrats are working, I think, on three basic pillars. One is rebuilding America's backbone, which really has to do with the middle class, and understanding those things that are so important in terms of being able to own your home and send your kid to college, and ways that you can save to get ahead, and ways that we can make sure that the American dream, which certainly I've been a big benefactor of, is very much alive and well. The second of those is leadership on the world stage, ways that we can show better support for our allies, and to call out those who are strong man governments and those autocrats around the world. And then the third pillar is to make sure that democracy is inclusive so that everyone gets a chance to participate. And that has to do with changing the way we finance our campaigns, and looking at voting rights and gerrymandering and the things that could make our democracy more inclusive.
And Dennis, knowing that you often disagree with President Trump, but are nonetheless a Republican who loves his country and is governed by conservative values, how does the Republican campaign best focus on conservative pillars such as fiscal responsibility, small government, security, especially now that we're in this strange age of COVID-19, but not just right now, but also a vision for a post-pandemic America?
Yeah, and it's interesting because our standard bearer, who is the president, does have, you know, a rather robust personality that can be abrasive at times to some. But the one thing about the Republicans, and I would suggest to them, is that when we had our convention a couple weeks ago, they adopted their platform in whole and without changes. And I think that shows that their guiding principles have not changed despite who may be at the top of the ticket. And I think that's encouraging for a conservative, for a Republican, is that the leader of the party is doing it in the fashion that he wants to do it in, that we may not all agree with the methods and manners, but the principles that have been part of our platform have continued to change. And in addition to that, I would also suggest that they have to focus on the successes of the administration. Again, the methods and manners are always in question. It's a personality thing. It makes it tough for some Republicans. But again, if they focus on the fact that we still have the same platform, the same principles, and that's the agenda we're moving forward, I'm hopeful that those Republicans will come out as time goes on.
And you've both had a chance to watch your party's convention, and clearly both conventions were different than any convention ever in the history of our country, given the parameters of having to stay socially distanced. For the Democrats, it was pretty much an entirely virtual convention. On the Republican side, there was more of an effort to also have some in-person events. Just give us, both of you, LF, if I may start with you, what kind of stood out for you with the convention? You've been to conventions in the past. Now watching it on a TV or computer screen, how do you feel the Democrats were able to connect, with their base, but also convincing someone who may still be on the fence?
So I thought the convention was a really good one. I wondered about it beforehand because much of what I've enjoyed about conventions in the past have been, getting together and all of the celebratory pieces of it. But I felt this one different, but I thought effective in that it was very much focused on getting a message out and a message regarding the Democrats' interest of making sure that we were able to have people understand that we feel that there's so much that could be done to bring us closer together and to make sure that we don't continue to be such a divided country. I think there's nothing that could be more helpful to us as a nation today than to find ways that we, Democrats and Republicans and people who maybe disagree, can continue to disagree, but to do it in a way that we can ultimately come together on important policy and to move forward. I thought an important part of the convention was introducing Kamala Harris, who's the vice presidential candidate. She's relatively new, I think, to the national political scene, although she did run for president. And I thought that was done successfully. I think reintroducing Joe Biden to the public was a good thing. I thought it was done well. I know Joe, I've worked with him. He's a really good person with a good heart. I think that came through as part of what we wanted to discuss. And the fact that the Democrats are reaching out, trying to get make the tent larger to get more people engaged in a way, again, that helps bring us all together.
Yeah, and Dennis, that same thought process now over to you, especially with the idea of expanding that base and bringing maybe some independents, but bringing some new people to the party.
And what we've seen is the evolution of the convention. I mean, probably since 1984, we haven't seen the contentious conventions that we used to see of not knowing who was going to be getting the nomination or the vice presidential nomination until the end of the convention. Now we've moved to the point where, with virtual technology, we can do a convention in a much different fashion, probably more efficient, probably more effective. And this may be the way things go here in the future. But it also allows our parties to put our best foot forward. And I think the Republicans did a good job with that in their virtual convention, which they also did a hybrid, if you will, and they had people in attendance, especially at the acceptance of the speech of President Trump on the White House lawn. It gives you a chance to highlight your positives. And I think the Republicans did a good job of accentuating the positive and a very promising future with the Republican Party. again, it's a media blitz, and that's what we've come to, which is why it's important that we're doing what we're doing to make sure that citizens get engaged in this. I mean, they should be watching these conventions. They should be asking the questions.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because that leads me to another question, which is engaging citizens. I think one of the things both parties have in common, now that both standard bearers are front and center. On the Republican side, you certainly have a great number of Republicans who are either never Trumpers or not that excited Trumpers, and on the Democratic side, you'll have a whole progressive wing that was very excited about folks like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, who now look at Joe Biden as more of a moderate rather than a progressive candidate. So Dennis, with that in mind, if somebody thinks of themselves as a conservative, doesn't agree 100% with what they're seeing right now with today's Republican Party, how can they still get engaged? How can they still be involved? How can they still be part of this?
Yeah, and first of all, we have to be engaged. That's the way our system was set up. And a lot of people don't want to be engaged because they just don't want to be part of this controversial discussion or they just don't want to be part of something where they can't feel accepted and somebody doesn't identify with them 100%. But I'm reminded of it, to use a sports analogy, we may not always like the head coach of our favorite football team, but that doesn't mean we don't like the football team. As long as they're winning, then that's okay. The ends kind of justifies the means. But more importantly, elections are about consumer involvement. And if you're going to be marketing a product to a consumer, you want to know what their wishes are, what their desires are, and you build that product and you market it to them. Elections are similar like that. The electorate are the consumers. And I think that they need to understand, the citizens need to understand that they've got to take this ownership of their citizenship and get engaged, and they can change how the people that they elect will respond to them, because they are the consumer, instead of the other way around where the elected influences the electorate. We have an obligation to be involved. We've got to be able to be the consumers of the elected so that we can show what our consumer preferences are in the leaders we want to have.
And I think LF on the Democratic side, similar notion where many think of Joe Biden, and I think that may even include Joe Biden, as a bridge between two generations of Democratic thought and Democratic candidates. So are you seeing something similar where, someone like a Kamala Harris, AOC, they're the next generation of Democrats, and in order to engage young voters and new Democrats, they need to have a voice and a seat at the table?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so pleased that so many young people are choosing to be a part of the Democratic Party. And as Dennis says, this is all about the people. I mean, the Constitution talks about we the people, and it's not we the government or we the Congress or we the presidency that's really in charge of our government and has written this Constitution. It's we the people, all of us, as members of Congress or as the folks who are out every day working hard to make this country better. And in fact, the second part of that statement, the preamble, is we the people in order to form a more perfect union. And that's what I think we're all about. We're trying to work as best we can. It didn't say to form a perfect union, but a more perfect union. And that's why I think, to the extent that we as Democrats who are now coalescing around Joe Biden as our candidate, Kamala Harris as our vice presidential candidate, feel very good about them and very good about where this is headed. But also, importantly, reaching out to the other side of the aisle so that we can bring all this together, and we, the people, then can really work together and really, truly make this a more perfect union. But it's so important that the people engage and get out and vote, certainly, or work in these campaigns or get involved. in order for this democratic experiment, as it's sometimes called, in order for this to truly work as well as it can and should.
Well, and LF, let me stay with you. Let me stay with that thought about people becoming engaged and people wanting to make sure their voices are heard. And we're seeing that across the country. You live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and of course, about 2 years ago, we all remember the horrendous 48 hours that Charlottesville had to endure when it came to violent clashes. And now, as you're seeing what's happening in Wisconsin, what's happening in Portland, one could lose hope very quickly. But on the other hand, it's also citizens, and 99% of them peaceful protesters, peaceful citizens, wanting to have their voices heard. So as you're seeing that, what gives you hope for the country and us getting through a very difficult year, but coming out united on the other end?
You know, I totally agree that it is a difficult year, and a lot of things have happened, including here in Charlottesville, and are happening that are symptomatic of some of the differences in this country. And a community like Charlottesville, a small college town, still struggles from the 48 hours that you described and what went on here. And I think other communities will find the same thing. But what heartens me is my seatmate when I was in Congress on the Ways and Means Committee was John Lewis. And John used to talk about his own experience and getting into good trouble. And I think that's a good thing, that people are demonstrating and talking about things that need to be talked about in this country. I think where it ceases to be good, and this happened in Charlottesville and it's happening in other places, is when people become violent and they begin to, burn buildings, or in our case, we actually had someone run over a number of people, and Heather Heyer, Charlottesville friend, was killed in that accident. Not an accident, but killed at that time. And these are the kinds of things that nobody wants to see happen, that people are entirely opposed to burning buildings and breaking glass and hurting innocent people. But the fact that all of the demonstrations that are happening, I think, are good ones. And as John Lewis used to say, don't tell me nothing's changed in my lifetime. As some people would say, I don't think much progress is being made, because he could cite his own biographical a journey, if you will, and talk about all the things that have changed. And we see it here in Virginia as well. And I'm totally encouraged by not only where we are, but where we are going. And I just think that there's so many tremendous opportunities. And again, it would be such a better journey if we can all get together and work better as one country and not be as divided as we are now. And people like Dennis and me who really work at that, to have people understand that and appreciate the fact that there's a lot of interest and a lot of bipartisanship that's happening. It just doesn't get much notice and much attention these days.
And Dennis, I know in your post-congressional path, that is one of the things you have really been passionate about and focused on, which is citizen engagement, and also how to combat this hyper-partisanship that's so pervasive now. And I know you've written on that. I know you started a leadership institute so that the next generation looks at our political process differently. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, at the American Center for Political Leadership, where I'm the director, what we believe in is not so much about the politics, but about the process. You know, LF and I have different political views, but we both agree on the greater good for America. It's just how we get there, as you pointed out, Pete, that we've always had our differences. And so, you know, protesting is one way of communicating that, but it's not governing. And there's a process put in place to govern that requires citizen involvement, individual participation. And so what we're trying to do is bring our sides together to be involved in this infrastructure of procedure, if you will, where these ideas can be vetted so that resolution can be achieved. And it's not unusual. Imagine being in the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in the summer in Philadelphia, where it's hot and they're arguing each over how they're going to build a country. But they did it by way of process, and they did it by way of compromise to come forward with the greatest nation we've ever known. That process still exists. And what we're failing to do is to identify the importance of each individual to be involved in the process. You know, I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or whatever. You've got good ideas. No one party has a monopoly on those. And if we can get engaged in the process as it was intended, we'll come to resolution of a lot of these things. But more importantly, we'll also realize how much we have in common, which gives us that common ground as a foundation to know that the future is going to be brighter. And that's what we're working on now. And I'm, you know, again, if I served with LF, we'd probably cancel each other's votes out every time. But that's okay. That's the process. And you know, campaigns are going to be protracted, now more polarized than ever. But it shouldn't frighten people from being involved. It should embolden them to want to get involved, to change it the way it ought to be.
Well, I think that's a great point to end this conversation on, because that's really the purpose of Yeas and Nays, our new project. FMC and Brave Angels want to remind everyone watching that democracy, our democracy, is not a spectator sport. For it to function, it requires an engaged and educated citizenry, certainly willing to debate the major important issues governing our future, but doing so in a productive, respectful, and pragmatic way, so that solutions rather than adversity are our guide going forward as a country. So for the next 2 months, you will be bombarded by incendiary ads and messages from both sides, and we'll try to give you a counterweight every Friday morning, showing Republicans and Democrats like LF Payne and Dennis Ross engaging in a thoughtful, respectful back and forth. Both of our organizations, Brave Angels and FMC, are nonpartisan and stand for a healthy representative democracy, but our democratic process only works if citizens embrace their responsibilities, which at a minimum is to go out and vote. Better yet, if there's an issue you feel passionately about, become involved in a grassroots effort. If there's a candidate you cannot wait to see elected, volunteer for her or his campaign, but please do so without thinking of the other side as the enemy. As LF Payne and Dennis Ross just demonstrated, a difference of opinion should not divide us into opposing tribes. That, to semi-quote Benjamin Franklin, is how we keep the republic. So please join us again next Friday. Please also visit our websites, braveangels.org, usafmc.org, and LF Payne, Dennis Ross. Thank you both so much for spending your time with us, and thank you for demonstrating exactly what we're talking about. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aleph. Thanks, Peter.